Daniel chapter 8. Back in 2009, there was a guy from London called Jamie. He was 19 years old at the time, and he decided to do a gap year. He flew to Australia and went on a hike through the outback. He visited some mountains in the state there of New South Wales, and he expected only to be a few hours out. But he decided therefore to leave his cell phone behind. Unfortunately, that trip turned into a 12-day-long nightmare, which he survived only by eating seeds and wild plants. He was lost, and to make matters worse, helicopters were actually flying over him, looking for him. And he would start screaming and waving his hands in the air, yet the pilots never seemed to notice him. Finally, after 12 days, he was found by two other hikers who helped him to get to a hospital. Now, of course, I'm not going to comment on the wisdom of such a hike or anything like that, but I'm telling you this story because it helps us to imagine that feeling, that realization of they don't know. That panicking, kind of despairing realization that you are in danger and lost and all alone, and nobody knows. Nobody knows where you are. Nobody's seen you. Nobody will come to help. Daniel chapter 8 tells us this hugely comforting lesson that God knows. And of course, not just when you go on a hike. No, God knows everything about us, everything about our circumstances, everything that's going on in the world around us. And God is in control. He is sovereign. He is at work even before we are in trouble. So let's look at Daniel's vision. What's going on? What does this all mean? And then we'll zoom out a few times to see what we can learn from it for today. First point to see is kingdoms come and go. And by now, if you've been with us through the book of Daniel, you know this is a theme that just keeps coming back. Kingdoms come and go. We see it again in this vision. Look at verse 1 again. It's the third year of King Belshazzar. And so this vision comes before the story that happened in chapter 5. Maybe you remember that's the story where Belshazzar celebrates his grand feast on the eve of the fall of Babylon. This happened before Daniel was in the lion's den during the reign of Darius the Mede. God already gave Daniel a look into the future in this vision to see what was going to happen. Now, in chapter 7, last week we looked at that, we saw that it basically describes the whole of world history in a nutshell. In the previous vision, here again we read of verse 1, after the one I already had before. That's the vision of chapter 7. And we saw there the whole of world history, as it were, unfolding. But also from the other perspective, God in heaven, the Ancient of Days on the throne, and Jesus, the Son of Man, coming to God, showing that God is in control. He is ruling. His kingdom lasts forever. That amazing kingdom where we will one day reign with Christ. And now we come to this second vision, again with animals and horns and lots of symbols. And it again shows us that world powers are raging against God. But this time it zooms in on the second and third kingdom. So chapter 7 described basically four kingdoms, where the fourth kingdom was sort of fading away into the whole of history. Now we zoom in on the middle bit. Kingdoms 2 and 3. Chapter 11 later on will do so again. And this means that the fulfillment of this vision in chapter 8 happens thousands of years ago. Unlike vision of chapter 7, where we sort of very presently are in that vision, in part of the history that it covers. Now here we look back at events that happened in the past. And there are two parts of the vision. Verse 3 to 8, we read of these two great kingdoms or empires that symbolized by a ram and a goat. And then in verse 9 to 14, it's the second part, and it zooms in on the reign of one particularly wicked king, described by a little horn. And the interpretation, starting in verse 15, it follows that same pattern. First, the general focus, then more specifically on that one king. So let's go through it. Verse 3, we see a picture of a powerful ram, a powerful beast. And in verse 20, the angel explains this is symbolizing the empire of the Medes and Persians. Daniel in his own life would see that ram coming up as it charged around to the east and the north and the south, as the vision describes. He was there in Babylon that night when Belshazzar's feast was, and when the city was taken by these very Medes and Persians. It conquered in all directions. Much like the bear in the previous chapter, it became very great by devouring many other peoples. It conquered Babylon too. But then after the ram, quite quickly, the vision fast forwards. And that's what we now know, some 200 years into the future. It goes from the year 538 BC, when the Persian Empire came to power, actually 200 years forward to 331 BC. And that's therefore far future for Daniel. How do we know this? Well, because it starts to describe a goat in verse 5. Coming from the west, so from modern day Greece, Turkey, that area. Charging from the west into the Middle East. Later in verse 21, this is explained by the angel as the king of Greece. He came there, and this is remarkable indeed. That first king, Alexander the Great, he conquered so fast. It's described as that ram, the goat, isn't even sort of touching the ground with its feet, as if it's almost flying across the country. So fast was his conquering. And indeed, from Greece, he went all the way up to modern day India, all the way down to modern day Egypt in just 10 years. And the Persians then too, symbolized by that ram, they could not stand against the overwhelming power. In verse 6, the vision describes that goat charged at the ram in great rage, and the ram was powerless to stand. In verse 7, it was trampled. None could rescue it. And the horns, remember that's a symbol in the Bible of power and strength. The horns of the ram were broken off. Their power was gone. And now the goat is taking power. And then in verse 8, it's just striking how accurate this prophecy is. Let's read verse 8 again. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the winds of heaven. And that's indeed exactly what happened. Because as maybe you know history, at just 33 years old, Alexander the Great suddenly died. And then 4 of his generals arose to power. They split up his kingdom. It didn't have the former power. Each sort of took its share. And they described then those 4 kingdoms led by his 4 generals. Verse 22 describes that for us. Now, first lesson then for us here is that the Bible is trustworthy. The accuracy of prophecies and such visions and their fulfillment throughout history has rightly continued to amaze people. It should amaze us. Do you see it? These events happened, but they were predicted 200 years before with such accuracy. Now, of course, many people now come to the book of Daniel, and they say, obviously this means that Daniel was written after that all happened, because that's just impossible. Well, their arguments for such a later date just don't stand up. If you look at the text, if you look at the historical data, it doesn't work. But what is much worse, by concluding that, they actually destroy the whole point of the book of Daniel. Because, think about it, if you say this is basically all a lie, not prophecy at all, it's just mere history writing after it had already happened, pretending to be prophecy, then all the comfort, all the encouragement to take heart and to continue through difficult times, it's all gone. Then God isn't the one who raises up kings and destroys them, but is just an observer of human actions and human violence. Now, far from that, this vision was given, this book is given, to show us that God is in control over all of world history. He knows the end from the beginning, and He has history in His hand. And fulfilled prophecy therefore confirms the Bible is God's inspired word. And another lesson from these verses is really, as we have seen throughout Daniel, much like what Paul would later describe in Acts 17. From one man God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and He marked out their appointed times in history, and the boundaries of their lands. That's what happens here. God is in control. Jesus later said we would hear of wars and rumors of wars, nation rising up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. That's from Matthew 24. Now, if we see that going on around us, you might well get very disappointed and frustrated, discouraged, worrying. When we watch it in the news and we see all these things going on, we might feel small and powerless, don't we? But remember then that the sovereign God is in control, and He knows, and He is working out everything according to the purpose of His will, to the praise of His glory. Now, Daniel doesn't just see that the future will bring these many wars and many different kingdoms. No, he sees more detail, as I've said before, that in that second part of that one wicked king who will severely afflict all the people of God. So let's, in the second point now, zoom in on that king. And we see that evil days are numbered. So we're now looking mainly at verse 9 to 14 and the way it is explained in verse 23 to 26. These verses about this specific one horn that rises up are fulfilled during the reign of a man called Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Fourth. You might think, okay, might never have heard of that name. Why is this important? Well, he was a king in the line of one of those four kingdoms that had come after Alexander the Great. It's called the kingdom of the Seleucids, modern day Syria and Iraq, that kind of area. And this man, Antiochus, he ruled from 175 to 164 BC, so not very long at all, just 11 years. And of the kings in his line, he wasn't even the most important of the greatest. And again, realize this is happening nearly 400 years in the future for Daniel. So all of that is, why would God tell us this? Is it like us hearing of one British king or prime minister in the year 2400? And you think, okay, why is that relevant? What's that got to do with us? Why was this one man so important that God revealed about his rule to Daniel? Let's first just check again what the vision says and then learn from it. Look at verse 10 to 12. It describes how that little horn rises up and starts to rage around. Verse 10 to 12 is actually very quite difficult. The detail is quite open to various interpretations, and the commentaries are full of debates on it. It's the explanation later in the chapter doesn't actually help that much for these three verses. By all the symbols, the references to the hosts and a rebellion and stars and so on. Ask me later if you want to know a bit more about this, but the main points are these. Daniel saw that there would come a very wicked king. He was going to persecute God's people. He was going to blatantly rebel against God. He called himself Epiphanes, which means manifest, God manifest. Considered himself God on earth. But he was called really Epimanes, madman, because of his raging. He attacked not just God, but he was ruthless, wicked. He attacked God's people too. And he attacked the worship of God in Jerusalem. You read of the temple sacrifices in verse 12, that the sacrifices were stopped by him. In history, we read more of the reign of this man in the book of 1 Maccabees. It's not a book in our Bibles, it's not part of our Bibles, it's part of the so-called Apocrypha. All the books that describe the period between the end of our Old Testament and the start of the New Testament. And there's no way I can do justice to the complexity of those 400 years, but just to give you a flavour what happened. Here is some of what this Antiochus did as he tried to force paganism on the Jews. The observance of all Jewish ordinances, and in particularly those relating to the Sabbath and circumcision, was prohibited on pain of death. And in every town in Judea, sacrifice was to be offered to the pagan idols. He sent out officers of his empire to see that the royal command was carried out, and where people did not comply willingly, they were obliged to do so by force. Once a month, people were checked, and whoever was found with the scroll of the Torah, the early books of the Bible, or whoever had a boy circumcised anyway, was put to death. He also went into the temple of God and he sacrificed a pig on the altar, just as to make a point, to desecrate the temple. And he put there a big statue of the Greek god Zeus. And as verse 24 and 25 summarize it for us, he destroyed, he killed many, many of God's people. This is the key then. The people of God had just never, up to that point, never before seen such severe persecution as under that man. That's why his name is still remembered for us, and why it is presented to us in this chapter of Daniel. This madman tried to wipe out Israel's faith and worship and life. And this vision is then given to Daniel to prepare the Jews for such a terrible time. For them, this prophecy of Daniel was hugely relevant and also encouraging, because it shows that God knew this was going to happen. And for us, and we see now, looking across history, that this man Antiochus stands in a line of all such great opponents of God, together with the Pharaoh of Egypt in the time of Moses, together with Haman, who tried to kill the Jews in the days of Esther, together with King Herod, who killed the infants in Bethlehem in the time of Jesus. After them followed the wicked Roman emperors Nero and Caligula, who persecuted the new Christian church in the decades just after Jesus went up to heaven. And just the rest of history is filled with men like this. Think of Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Enver Hoxha in Albania in a couple of decades ago, Kim Jong-un in North Korea today, and so on. Men who rage, who oppress, who kill. And this man Antiochus then, that the vision of Daniel's all about, he becomes like a type, a picture of all those opponents of God, of those persecutors of God's people, these, what you could call these antichrists. He is described as a little horn in that third kingdom. And maybe you remember, in the fourth kingdom, that we saw last week in chapter 7, there was also a little horn. But that one was in the fourth kingdom. So you see, even from these visions, there's little horns rising up as the biggest persecutors. You could say that's the biblical picture used in these visions then, to describe that line of all these men who stand up against God and his people. That's the pattern, eventually ending with a final great antichrist. But then there's the good news. The good news is that their days are numbered. Look at verse 13 and 14. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled?" He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." So 2,300 evenings and mornings, either that's just over 6 years, or people say, well, that's morning sacrifices and evening sacrifices, so more like just over 3 years. Whichever it is, it roughly matches major events in that period of time under Antiochus. Whichever of the two it is, the days are limited. Yes, it's a rather long period, and it was very severe for those people. But it is definitely a limited one. And God knows the end. God has counted the days of their rule, and they will end. See verse 25. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Now again, zooming out, what can we learn from this for us today? A vision of that speaks of kingdoms and a wicked king more than 2,000 years ago. What's the point for us today? I think it's this. Whatever is going on, even when all those kingdoms come and go, as we see that the hardest days are ultimately numbered, remember then again, our sovereign God knows. That lesson doesn't merely apply on a grand world scale, but it also does in our personal lives. So if you are in pain, or if you feel lonely, life's not going as you hoped it would, if you are anxious about this new term at school, and what it will bring, and whether or not maybe people will bully you because you are a Christian, or if you feel with our persecuted brothers and sisters across the world and what they are going through, With so many things going on in the world around us, we may well be tempted to think like that hiker in the wilderness. Like, does anybody know? Am I all alone? Will anybody come to help? Do I have to bear this all alone? And then we can know, no, we are not alone. Our sovereign God knows. We are not alone. There is someone, with a capital S, someone who can help, who has it all in his hands. And therefore there is no need to despair, even when dark and difficult times come, because they will end. God is raising up people and armies and kings and prime ministers. Yes, he is orchestrating events from a heavenly throne room. And God doesn't just know, but realize he knows it beforehand. Even before we can see it or even get into a difficult situation, God already knows about it, and he is already at work to prepare things to come together in such a way that we will in the end know his blessing and his care for us. He is at work to help a doctor diagnose your disease. He is at work to overthrow a persecuting government. Or he is at work to stir the hearts of other people to come at just the right time with encouragement, or with financial help, or with a meal, or just simply their presence. God knows, and he is sovereign. And that makes us see that we have a part in that. It's a very personal consequence, because you can think, okay, what is my role then in that plan of God? Maybe you experienced as well at some point what we think is a chance encounter. You just happen to bump into someone totally unexpected. Or someone calls or messages you at the very right time, just when you needed some encouragement. Maybe you have heard of the life of a man called George Mueller, 150 years ago or so, who cared for thousands of orphans in the city of Bristol. His life, if you read his biography, was full of that. Again and again and again. Money or clothing or food for all those kids showed up just at the right time. God had already been working in someone who had to leave his home or go on the journey or send the money weeks before with postage times in those days. And I've been surprised sometimes by what we can only call the prompting of the Holy Spirit and the work of the Spirit in us, right? That you think, oh, it's so random. Why do I suddenly think of this person that I haven't thought about for months maybe? And you think, I should get in touch. I'll send them a message. I'll give them a ring. And it turns out to be the very time that they needed that. And it brings you together again, and it gives such encouragement. It's the Spirit helping us to be there. God at work, preparing things to come together for good. And indeed, that might give the most remarkable situations then to come together where we can praise God together with a friend or a family member. God uses ordinary Christians like you and me in the unfolding of his plans in this world. And so when we are going through difficult times, let's keep trusting that God knows, and that every single day is numbered, that our Heavenly Father is in control, and that we can trust that he is already working to bring help or comfort or relief at the right time, because he saw our need coming. And of course that may take longer than we would love it to come. It may take longer, it may not happen even in our lifetime, but that does not mean that God has forgotten, or that it is therefore pointless. And we see the same trusting, faithful response of Daniel in the last verse of the chapter. And that's where I want to finish as well. So thirdly, continue the king's business. See verse 27 again. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. It just strikes me in the middle of this chapter where it's been about massive beasts and armies and raging opponents of God. We get that detail. I got up and went about the king's business. I picked up the work again. Initially, the vision was so heavy upon Daniel that the whole experience put him to bed for several days. Do you see it? Just let's realize this was not an easy thing for Daniel to receive it, to have such a glimpse in the plan of God and to see those angels and that majestic power of God. And one thing that is emphasized in the interpretation by the angels, and in this case it's still complicated enough as you've seen, but it is also that Daniel is looking quite far into the future. Verse 17 says, to the time of the end. Or verse 19, the time of wrath. Or again, the appointed time of the end. And verse 26 calls it even the distant future. And before we then sort of automatically jump to okay, this must be at the end of time as we normally speak about it, that's a bit too quick. Because when the angel refers to the vision, in verses 17 and 19 and 26, where these references is found, it seems to be particularly about the reign of that little horn and that time of persecution. And in that context, the angels ask that question of how long? How long? Verse 13 and 14. And Daniel now knew some of what the future would bring. It would bring very difficult times. Tough times. But the end and the reign of that little horn, it would only come in the distant future for him. Not during his own lifetime. And yet he doesn't conclude, okay, this was all pointless then. Why did I see it? No. Daniel's life is still useful. And he continued to work for the king and do his job. And so it is for us. In our Christian life today, we are looking into the future too. And actually for us, we are looking forward to the very end of time. And since Daniel, we have received the teaching from Jesus. And we've received the book of Revelation. We are living in these last days. The days between the two comings of Jesus. He has come in to bring this kingdom, but we still wait for the full revelation of it. The consummation. The final day of judgment for all God's enemies and those wicked rulers. The day that will also be the vindication for all God's people. For you and me, that we can come into God's presence and live with Him forever. All who believe in Jesus. And as we are waiting for that day then, and as we hear of wars and rumors of wars, and as we see the signs of the times, let's act like Daniel. Don't go and sit idly like the Thessalonians did. 2 Thessalonians 3. Don't think that our lives are futile and hopeless with such evil still to come. No. Let's go about the king's business. And that means two things for us in closing. Firstly, it means that we, like Daniel, just keep doing our jobs, our tasks. So when you go back in the workplace tomorrow to make calculations or design a component or help a customer or prepare a meeting, or when you go into the classroom to teach or to learn, or when you go to visit a relative to help them, care for them, or when you raise your children at home, when you do your homework, in all of it, that is not futile. No, do it with the realization that our sovereign God knows, that all the times are in His hands and that they are the outworking of His plan. As Paul wrote in Colossians 3, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord and not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And the second thing to go about the king's business is that if you are a Christian tonight, you and I have a much greater king we serve, don't we? A king, Jesus, who has taken us into His service. And He said in Matthew 24, again, instructing the disciples about the days to come, Matthew 24:12, because of the increase of wickedness, think Daniel 8, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And that's therefore part of our task in the king's business. Because He called us to go and make disciples of all the nations and be instruments in His hand to bring His kingdom together, and as it were, to work to that time of the end. And He promised, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Jesus desires that all the nations will be reached with the good news of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of a place in God's family, all through Christ. And He wants us all to hear that today. So have you responded to that call? Do you know Christ? Are you right with God tonight? Have you believed in Jesus? A chapter like Daniel 8 prepares us for the days to come. But as Jesus said in John 16 verse 1, I have said all these things to keep you from falling away. So let's keep these things in mind. Therefore, brothers and sisters, let's persevere, because the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Amen.